Well, thank you for coming. This is kind of an emergency move on our part, but I think we'd be a lot more miserable in an unconditioned stone building. So my name is Robert Villa. I'm the president of PHS. I've already known that. Any board members, just raise your hand. Just me and Maggie, it looks like, but if you have any questions about PHS or a newcomer, just feel free to say hello. So we are second. Okay. So we are on Chamamak Dua, otherwise known as Tuamak Hill. Chamamak Dua means Horned Lizard Mountain. And this is the traditional homeland of the Atom and many diverse indigenous groups here in the Tucson area. The top of the mountain has over 250 pit houses that were inhabited as early as 6,000 years ago. And why do you think, this is an open question, why do you think that Tuamak Hill is called Tuamak Hill? Like, what is there anything about horned lizards that allude to naming this mountain after them? Because I've seen this hill from many angles and I can't quite place whether it looks like a horned lizard or not. But I have an idea, and that is that an Auburn person was describing to me how they would grind mesquite pods in these bedrock depressions, and you usually see more than two. And you can think, well, maybe people like to grind mesquite beans together and chat and talk, and that's probably what happens. But she said, well, I would start grinding in one hole, and the ants would show up, and I'd have to move to the next hole and start grinding there. And then the ants would show up there, and then I'd have to move to the next one. And of course, what eats ants? Horned lizards. And so if you can imagine the population of people on the hill at its peak, there might have been a lot of grinding, a lot of ants, and a lot of horned lizards. That's just a guess, but I'm open to suggestions. Across the valley, this way, is Babat. Babat means toad. And see if this works again. The pointer may be right to this antenna, which I will rearrange. This is the west side of the Push Peak, which looks like a giant toad. Let this person in. Anyhow, before I talk about merchandise, we are at one of the oldest, not the oldest, active research station in the world. This is the Desert Laboratory. It was built in 1903 by Andrew Carnegie. And his institution hired Daniel McDougall, the director of the New York Botanical Gardens, to scout around the world's deserts to build a desert laboratory to understand how plants exist and survive in deserts in anticipation of human settlement in the desert. They went to Gobi, they went to different parts of Mexico, and they eventually landed back in Tucson, the first place they stopped, because it was just really convenient for a variety of reasons. So this building, this room we're in, was the original library, and then this eventually became a carbon dating lab. People would carbon date samples. This is the birth of pack rat knitted analysis. So looking at the plants that pack rats would cement with their urine and feces over time, we could actually understand the landscape thousands of years ago based on what they preserved that way. So this just has a really long history of desert science, and it's I won't go any further, but the discipline of ecology had a lot to do with this place. That over half of the founders of the Ecological Society of America were scientists at the Desert Laboratory. And they turned a hobbyist journal, the Plant World. By 1930, they had converted it into the Journal Ecology from this facility. So we're in a really historic place, and I couldn't go on without letting you know about where you are at tonight. So I digress. Please buy lots of our merchandise. I'm wearing one of the shirts. We have the classic dancing Gila monsters, and we also have them on the tote. And plenty of THS members have written excellent books about our regional urban fauna. Okay. So the follow-up to the snakes of Arizona is going to be 2 books, Amphibians and Turtles of Arizona and the Lizards of Arizona. This is a website where you can upload any photographs you'd like to contribute, any observations you'd like to contribute. Just go to this website, argosaz.org. Paul Mayer is conducting a phylogenetic study of Gila monsters, and I will move this out of the way so that you can see his phone number. And if you see a Gila monster or would like to participate, go ahead and contact him. These are all the outreach events we've done. These are ones that are coming up. I think this clicker is really slow, Tom, so just bear with it. What's that? I've been involved with the Sonoran Desert Toad and how it's being seen by the psychedelic world, and it's increased attention by that world and trafficking and public education about the species. So if you go to azpm.org, to Arizona Illustrated, there's a whole segment on that. And we have a visitor from South Africa, Kimon de Gref, who is a journalist and is in Tucson and Sonora for a couple of weeks to get the lay of the land. And so, yeah, welcome, Kimon. This is our newest issue of Sonoran Herpetologist. It's free on our website. And you can catch all of our previous talks recorded on our YouTube channel. Before I introduce Tom, next month we will have a visitor from India who studies king cobras, Gauri Shankar. He'll be here, and he's looking for people to show him rattlesnakes because we would really love to see a rattlesnake. He's never seen them. So if you're interested in helping, I would really appreciate some leads or some volunteers because I have a very hectic and busy life myself. Yep.
This next month.
Oh, next month we'll be back at our regular U of A venue. This month, I guess they just had like a vacation or something. I don't know why, but they weren't accepting reservations this month. All right. Tom Jones is the Amphibian, the Reptile Program Manager for the Arizona Fish Department, where he oversees the conservation and management of amphibians and reptiles. He received a BS and MS at Auburn University and a PhD at ASU, Arizona State University. He was a postdoc researcher at the University of Michigan, a visiting assistant professor at Eastern Carolina University, and for 11 years, he was a professor at Grand Canyon University. He is also a really nice guy, very knowledgeable, and a great person to see with the field. So I'll take my check. And let me catch. Thank you, Tom, for coming and speaking.
You bet. Thank you. So am I going to be able to use that clicker at all?
I hope so. 1 second.
online. So where's the camera? For the people online?
There is
They-
no camera.
They're just looking at the screen.
Correct.
Good, that's better.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, so I'm gonna just move over here a little bit. Is that okay? Everybody? I don't know if the clicker will work from here.
Now, if this works the way it's supposed to.
Right over here. Is that works?
If I change the batteries.
So.
Thanks for your patience, everybody, but I think. We should have.
So while he's doing that, I can actually start. This, I say this is a brief history, it is not a brief history, it's really a lengthy history of herpetology at the Arizona Game and Fish Department. But I want to make it very clear at the outset that nothing that we have done at Game and Fish has been done in a vacuum. We have partners all over, some of whom are in this room, that have done a lot of work with us, or for us, or sent to us. So this is just a brief look at the agencies and entities that have contributed to what we've done at Arizona Game and Fish Department for many years. And then some real shout outs to folks that helped me put this together. I think Mike Schwalbe is entirely disgusted with me bothering him every 10 minutes for more information on the history of game and fish. So maybe doing this in mind.
It's every time I hit back that it
So we won't get back.
yeah.
All right, let's see. Okay, so to start out with, I'm going to try and go back into a little bit of deep history. Randy Babb talked to you folks last month about exotic species in Arizona, and I'm not going to repeat that, but it is worth noting that bullfrogs were the first game species that was noted in Arizona, along with soft-shell turtles, as one of the many varieties of the finny tribe, as noted in this particular article from 1929. But they weren't considered they weren't considered what we call wildlife in Arizona. By statute, wildlife has particular definitions, and animals that fall under the definition of wildlife are therefore property of the state. They can be managed, they can have bag limits, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. So in 1933, the department actually identified bullfrogs as a game fish, along with all the other species of fish. The wild bullfrog was now considered game. Notice that rabbits aren't predatory animals, which is good to know. You haven't seen lots of time. So in 1933, this is the first herp to be a game species in Arizona. Are you gonna have to just do this one?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry.
That's right. Finally, in 1945, amphibians were considered game animals, but it's worth noting that the only amphibian that they referred to in those days was bullfrog. So all the other amphibians didn't count as game animals, only bullfrogs counted as game animals. Next, please.
Sorry.
That's all right. And then many of you, I think, are aware of this, that in 1952, Gila monsters were protected by the state. So people could no longer collect them or kill them. And horned lizards were protected as well. Although there was no effort to distinguish among the various horned lizards, it was just horned toads or horned lizards were protected as of 1952. That particular image right there is from 1953, but the 1952 one says the same thing. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to that, I know the back is a bad word, but you see up on commission order number P7, night hunting of any wildlife except amphibians is prohibited. So we could go lizard hunting at night.
Lizards weren't wildlife, so it didn't matter. They didn't care. Yeah, it was only wolves.
I just wanted to check.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Maybe there's some.
So in 1954, the first book or booklet about amphibians and reptiles in Arizona was written by a fisheries biologist named Jack Killian, who was only with the department for 3 years and did mostly fish work where they went out and they wrote down huge lakes to get rid of the rough fish that they didn't like. But he at least had an interest in herps. And I'll let you read yourselves about your favorite particular herp there. But there was nothing in depth necessarily, but at least it was relatively accurate what he presented for these common species. Next one. And then finally, in 1967, the term wildlife encompassed all reptiles and amphibians. So now all of these animals were considered property of the state. It was the state's responsibility to take care of these animals for the good of the people of Arizona. And then the following year in commission order, and I should just point out this is just detail, but laws are statute and wildlife, the definition of wildlife is in statute. And then commission orders are what open and close seasons for various things and set the times of year for those seasons. And in 1968, the commission order, they closed the season on the 3 primary montane rattlesnakes that I think most of you are aware of. Next. Then in 1979, the next kind of major thing was law enforcement officers produced this document. It kind of illustrates the high profile of what was considered at the time the illicit herp trade or snake trade. And notice the quote there that they refer to the popular collecting areas arresting illicit snakers. And although they deserve some credit for trying to stop the illegal trade in amphibians, reptiles, I think they were a little bit overzealous in those days, and herpers or snakers, as you all are, were painted with a rather broad brush. And I'm going to return to this law enforcement aspect in just a little bit. Next one. So everything changed in 1983 when the Nongame or the state income tax checkoff was instituted, and that created the Nongame Branch of the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And Terry Johnson, who used to work with the Natural Heritage Program down here in Tucson, was hired as the first branch supervisor. Terry had a lot of experience with birds, a lot of experience with herps as well. So he was a pretty good choice as branch supervisor, and he's also somewhat of a genius and did a really good job of setting up the Nongame Branch. Next. His first hire was Cecil Schwalbe in January 1984, and Cecil was hired as the herpetologist. And notice this is just 6 months after the beginning of the Nongame Branch when Cecil was hired. He was the herpetologist. He was the second state herpetologist in the country. I think the only other one was in Missouri. Was that right, Mike? And the reason I included this particular article in Wildlife Views from March 1984, this is just 3 months after Cecil started, they're talking about priorities in the fast lane. Cecil was already writing funding proposals to the Fish and Wildlife Service to start working on a variety of animals that they thought needed conservation, needed some conservation input. Next. Now, I put these photos in here because and many of you didn't know Cecil Schwalbe. Some of you did. When I was a graduate student at ASU, I knew Cecil quite well. We went out in the field together. I knew him when he was working for Chuck Lowe down here at U of A. And a lot of people think of Cecil as kind of a happy-go-lucky guy. He's going out in the field. He was a lot of fun. He got bit by a Gila monster. He had alligator to be involved, go down and catch beaded lizards and Alamos. But there was so much more to Cecil Schwalbe than met the eye and that the general public or even his colleagues might have recognized. And those contributions, that's fine. Those contributions, I should mention, were profound and long lasting. One of the first things that Cecil and Terry Johnson did was they published this book with Chuck Lowe on the venomous reptiles of Arizona. And it is the first herp book published since the 1954 booklet by Killian. So 30 years later, we finally got another book about Arizona herps next. So the group set up a bunch of priorities. The group meaning those who formed the Nongame Branch. And Cecil and Terry in particular started identifying non-game priorities and getting funding to pursue some of those priorities. This particular project on flat-tailed horned lizards actually started when Terry was down here in Tucson with the Natural Heritage Program, but he and Mary Spicer, who was the mammalogist at Game and Fish, finished it up in 1985 through the Game and Fish Department. And this one and the next several slides will illustrate the priorities of the time in the early 1980s that Terry and Cecil in particular, had identified as conservation priorities for game and fish. Next. The first of those, the new priority, was to survey for Arizona mud turtles and learn more about them because we knew so little. So they got funding for John Iverson, who was at I just grew a blank.
Indiana.
No, he was in Nebraska, but I can't remember, Earl College. And John is a turtle expert, a mud turtle expert in particular. And he came out here and went all over southern Arizona and Sonora and produced this document in 1985, giving us a better understanding of Arizona mud turtles. I don't know why I keep holding this. It's not anything, is it? Next, please. The next one is, I think most of you here probably know the tragic story of the loss of terramar frogs in Arizona, documented by Steve Hale, pictured here. Steve did a bunch of work with terramar frogs in the late 70s, identified a new population of Santa Ritas with a number of other folks that they published in the Arizona and Nevada Academy of Sciences, and documented the decline of terramar frogs in Arizona. So one of the priorities when Nongame Branch started was to find out more about them. We knew that they died off in Big Casablanca Canyon and the Santa Ritas. We knew that they died off in Sycamore Canyon and closely related canyons to those two. But we needed to know more. So Game and Fish provided funding through the Fish and Wildlife Service to Steve Hale to produce the 1988 document that he did with Jim Jarko on the status of T-frogs in Arizona and in Sonora. Next. Another grant that they got from the Fish and Wildlife Service about the same time was a grant to learn more about the distribution and status of narrow-headed garter snakes and Mexican garter snakes. And Phil Rosen was hired by Cecil to do that work. Phil, being an amazing field biologist, he just spent all of his time out in the field grubbing up garter snakes from all over their respective distributions in Arizona. And he and Cecil produced this document in 1988. That has become a very important document from which to compare garter snake status in 1988 with garter snake status in this last decade or so. Next, please. And then the Sonoran Desert Tortoise. Excuse me, this is another big priority for the Nongame Branch. And you'll notice in 1984, Cecil recommended closing the season, closing collecting on Sonoran Desert Tortoises. This is in 1984. He was hired in 1984, and just a few months later was willing to bump the system and say, you need to close the season on this particular animal for a variety of reasons. Cecil also helped to form the Arizona Interagency Desert Tortoise Team, which started in 1985. He was the co-chair of it. In '86, the AIDTT recommended closing the season on desert tortoise. It wasn't closed yet. Thank you. Cecil pointed out rightly that research needed to be conducted on the population status and the effects of various land use practices. Finally, in 1988, the commission closed the season on desert tortoises, and then the AIDTT produced a draft Arizona Desert Tortoise Management Plan. But one of the things that they pointed out in that draft plan was that long-term population studies need to be established, because this is an animal that lives 60, 70, perhaps 80 years. We don't know anything about it if all we do is go out and look at the status right now. Next. And then the next priority, and I think this is the last of the main priorities of the time. In September 1986, Cecil and a variety of others, including Phil Rosen, and I think some people in this room, started working on attempts to eradicate bullfrogs at San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. These were really important efforts. Cecil and Phil published on it in 1988 in this symposium that was held in Flagstaff. It wasn't a successful effort in the end, but we learned an awful lot from it. Cecil and I have had many conversations over the years about some of the mistakes and some of the things that they did right at San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. And it really set the stage for our understanding of controlling or eradicating this particular invasive species. Next, please. One of the other things Cecil did, and he loved this, and it was a big part of his entire career. It was outreach, educating the public. And he established this weekend workshop primarily for teachers that he called Herps for Twerps. And Herps for Twerps started, I think, in 1987. Next, please. And was picked up by Randy Babb, who, by the way, is here in his interview guns. The day he interviewed a Game Fish. And Randy was an important part. The only time you learn to see them. And hair, too. And Randy brought a sense of humor that was really complimentary to Cecil's and an artistic ability to reach out to folks about herp conservation. Randy continued Herps for Twerps up to about 2000 with at least one Herps for Twerps weekend every year. And then about 2000, the education branch, where Randy was working at the time, discontinued those for reasons that were never quite clear to me. But the teachers that participated in those, I helped Randy in a few of them. We got all kinds of letters and emails from the teachers telling us how much it meant to them and what they brought to their students when they went back to grammar school or high school or wherever they were teaching, and passed those messages on. Okay, next. So, returning to law enforcement for a moment. One of the things that Cecil did was he participated in a lot of high-profile herp-related law enforcement cases. He was the first person that law enforcement could go to that really knew what he was looking at. Cecil would identify the animals, he would wrangle the animals. In some cases, he would hold them for temporarily until whatever the case was adjudicated, and the animals could go to the zoo or wherever. And this is really important for the history of law enforcement in Arizona, because what Cecil did was he humanized herping. He was no longer just a snaker. He humanized herping for a lot of law enforcement personnel. And they got to know Cecil, got to like him, everybody did like him. So that was easy. And he really changed the landscape for a lot of law enforcement personnel. Not all of them necessarily, but for many of them. And that was a really important aspect of what he did. Okay, next. Very briefly, in 1988, the department finalized something they call threatened native wildlife in Arizona. What this did, this was not a list really of endangered species. The Game and Fish Department and the Commission was never willing to create an Endangered Species Act for Arizona. But they created this list originally in 1975. The commission didn't approve it. In 1978, there was another version they approved. 1982, it was revised. You might notice it says CH low up there in the top. It was interesting to read this because it said in 1975, the Arizona Game and Fish Department created, and Chuck Lowe scratched that out and wrote with help. So in 1988, it became threatened native wildlife in Arizona. And this provided a focus for the department, as well as a focus for partners, other agencies like BLM, Forest Service, and others, to identify the animals that Arizona Game and Fish Department thought were worthy of conservation, or at least needed more work done on them. Next. So this has nothing to do specifically with the Game and Fish Department, but in 1990, in September 1990, the first World Congress of Herpetology in England identified, brought together a whole bunch of people that collectively identified that amphibians were declining all over the world. And it was the first opportunity for global recognition of this phenomenon. Nobody knew if this was really all caused by the same thing or if there were many different causes for it, but there was global recognition of amphibian declines. But remember, Steve Hale had already pointed out a serious amphibian decline in Arizona that resulted in the extirpation of Panamá frogs from the state. We knew, at least anecdotally, that Chiricahua leopard frogs appeared to be declining in some places. There were anecdotal reports of lowland leopard frogs that had died off in some areas. So we had already tasted this global decline, and it again helped to focus things here at the Arizona Game and Fish Department. So we were already looking into other ranids by the time this came out. Next. So in 1990, Cecil moved on to U of A, the USGS. It was the end of the era. You think about it, Cecil was only there for 6 years. It's pretty remarkable what he accomplished in those years. But he still became, or still remained, quite active with folks at the Arizona Game and Fish Department. So what's next? What do we do? Well, in 1990, June of 1990, Terry Johnson hired Mike Shredel as the next biologist. And this really is a picture from his interview. Anybody who knows Mike knows he doesn't age. It's not fair. But Mike sent me a memo from Terry Johnson that he got on the first day of work. Terry wasn't there. He left him a memo saying, look through the leopard frog files, start working on Yellow-Paiensis. And he also said, talk to Randy Babb. He's a fount of information. And they had $20,000 from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Rented Frogs project was born at that point and led by Mike for the next 26 years. Let's see. Okay, next. Heritage funding. In the 1990s, the heritage funding made a big difference at the Arizona Game and Fish Department. In November of 1990, so this is a few months after Mike started, Proposition 200 was passed with 62% of voter approval that created the Heritage Fund. And the Heritage Fund was designed to bring $10 million annually to state parks and $10 million annually to the Arizona Game and Fish Department. That number never changed, by the way, so we're still at $10 million a year here 30 years later. So inflation has kind of taken down that amount. However, it was overwhelmingly approved by the public, and I only include this Foes Unite and Boost Parks because Bruce Babbitt and Barry Goldwater both got together and pushed for this particular initiative for the state. Okay, next. So the 1990s started the heritage funding, and Jeff Mallon was brought on in November of 1990, right after the Heritage Fund passed, and he became the Amphibians and Reptiles Program Manager. Cecil was the herpetologist. Cecil was a one-man show at the department, Now, Jeff was hired to be the Amphibians and Reptiles program manager and to build a program. So he had a lot of work to do. And he was pursuing all the priorities that were set in the 1980s. He continued to get funding for tortoises, for rabbit frogs, for flat-tailed horned lizards, and others, and worked to get interagency agreements done. And excuse me, working with other agencies and entities. Jeff told me that during his time period there, he was able to do precious little field work because he felt that he was mostly an administrator, making sure that his folks could still do what they needed to do. However, his contributions are still very important in rabbit frogs and in tortoises both. He hired Chris Klug as Desert Tortoise Field Team leader. And then another person named Vanessa Dickinson was hired by the research branch to do a tortoise health study. The Desert Tortoise Field Team leader was supposed to be doing some of the monitoring that was being done for desert tortoises. Next, please. So, excuse me, these are two seminal documents that were completed very soon after Jeff Howland started. In fact, Jeff is a co-author on one of them, and he had barely been in the department for a month, and he already participated in writing the desert tortoise population studies at 4 plots. So this was the beginning of what we now refer to as long-term monitoring plots. Throughout the state, a variety of plots were set up in the distribution of desert tortoises, and they are being monitored every few years by a team, and those data are being brought forth year to year, decade to decade to understand patterns in desert tortoise population status. The status summary was mostly a distribution study of tortoises throughout Arizona, knowing where they occurred, and that was done by Sherry Barrett, who went on to work with Fish and Wildlife Service, and Terry Johnson. Next. And then in 1994, Jeff Howland produced this document, which is a summary of long-term monitoring plots. They weren't long-term yet, they were just barely getting started. But plot surveys that were done in 1991, 92, and 93. These are the summaries of those surveys. The department was doing those surveys to start with, but it turned out to be too onerous in terms of resources, people, time, money. So the department started farming those out to contractors after this. Next. So flat-tailed horned lizards was another one of those priorities we talked about a little while ago. Jeff hired a young woman named Wendy Hodges, who worked on distribution, basically status of flat-tailed horned lizards in Arizona. She left to go to grad school at the University of Texas, and that's where she completed this particular study in 1995. In 1997, the flat-tailed horned lizard range-wide management strategy was finished, and this established an interagency coordinating committee, which is made up of biologists, some agency people, mostly anybody who was interested in desert in flat-tailed horned lizard biology, and then a management oversight group, which was made up of the leaders of the agencies that were signatory to this particular agreement. So the leader, the head of BLM, the head of Park Service, the head of the DOD properties on which flat-tails were found, king and fish, and so forth. And the way it evolved in Arizona was that the regional supervisor in our Yuma office became our MOG member. And next slide, please. The non-game biologist, Lynn Peace, in the Yuma office, was on the interagency coordinating committee, and he led monitoring efforts in Arizona and Sonora for many years. Later on, another revision of the conservation agreement or the management strategy was done in 2003. And then in the early 2000s, well, I guess kind of mid 2000s, our wildlife contracts branch picked up all of the work for monitoring and surveying and the research that is done on flat-tailed horned lizards. Next. So in 1995, Roy Murray, who later became April Murray, was hired as a desert tortoise coordinator. Roy had just gotten his master's with Cecil at the University of Arizona, and Roy's master's thesis was on mark and recapture studies of storm desert tortoises. And Roy was an active researcher and a perfect person for this position. And he started a tortoise reproductive ecology study, a movement study and survivorship at a place called Sugarloaf, which is an area in the Tonto National Forest northeast of Phoenix. Chris Blue, as I mentioned a moment ago, became the field leader for those studies. And these Roy also set up more long-term monitoring lots for desert tortoises throughout their distribution. Next. So there was a draft management plan, if you remember, way back I talked about in the 80s. That management plan for the Sonoran population, Sonoran desert population, the desert tortoise, was finalized in 1996 by the AIDTT, the Arizona Interagency Desert Tortoise Team. There's a lot of stuff that went on before this. It was a draft in 1986, and it was another 10 years before it was finalized, but there was all kinds of listing things that were going on at the time. It was all delayed, but it finally became a document that was signed again by various agencies. It became the blueprint for interagency cooperation in desert tortoise management. Next. So in 2000, Roy and Chris Blue produced this document, which was monitoring ecology of the storm desert tortoise in Arizona. And basically, it was a summary of the decades worth of long-term monitoring and plot research and the Sugarloaf studies that Roy had initiated back in 1995. And again, this is a very important document because it kind of brought it all together. What do we know about storm desert tortoises? Here it is in one place. This is an internal document, a non-game technical report, but Roy was also publishing peer-reviewed literature about this work at the same time. Next, please. So next, and again, I'm juggling the timeline because none of this is linear. Anastomos is all over the place. But in 1999, Mike Denlong came on as the next Amphibians Reptiles Program Manager. Mike had come from the Phoenix Zoo. He had great familiarity with rented frog conservation, which I'll come back to in a couple of minutes. And he was largely an administrator in those days as well. He also spent time working the national efforts to secure non-game wildlife management funding. That didn't make it. There's another push now to try and get that same kind of funding. But Mike was only the program manager for a little less than 4 years. Next. Continuing with tortoises, after Chris Blue left, Darren Riddle was hired as the desert tortoise field coordinator. His work shifted to another spot other than the Sugarloaf, although he did some work at Sugarloaf. But he went to the Florence Military Reservation, which is just north of Florence, Arizona, where they did a lot of work paid for by the Army National Guard, the Arizona Army National Guard. Resulted in these two publications and actually some others later on by some other folks. So Darren was very active as the desert tortoise field coordinator. Next. So in 2002, kind of jumping around the timeline again, Roy Murray became the Amphibians Reptiles Program Manager for the next couple of years. And again, the program manager's job, unfortunately, is a lot of administration. And Roy told me that his biggest focus was to expand the Herps program beyond tortoises and round frog work. In trying to do that, he hired Kim Field, who went to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service later as a herp conservation planner to develop safe harbor agreements and look at other general conservation opportunities. Kim was only in that position for a short time before she went to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I might add, Roy went to the Fish and Wildlife Service to direct recovery for the Mojave Desert tortoise And Kim also went, he dragged her with him. So we lost Kim Field right off the bat. Roy was the program manager. Now, next slide. Another thing that Kim did was she shepherded production of the next booklet on Arizona herps that was done by Tom Brennan and Andy Holycross on the Amphibians and Reptiles of Maricopa County. And then Roy was not just the administrator, he continued to work on desert tortoises and publish, and included, he was a co-author on at least 3 chapters in this seminal work in 2002 on desert tortoises. When Roy left, Darren became the lead for desert tortoises, desert turtles in Arizona, but Darren wanted to expand the scope a little bit. So he changed it from desert tortoise project coordinator to desert turtles project coordinator, and actually ended up doing some work on Rio Sonata. And ended up publishing a couple of papers, this one with Phil Rosen, as a matter of fact, and with Christina Jones, who came along later and replaced Darren. I think. So, yeah, next slide. All right. So, swinging back in time, continuing priorities. One of the biggest priorities that I identified a little while ago was Granite Frogs project that Mike Shredel started. Mike referred to this to me as the 1990s as the time of embryonic conservation projects. What Mike was doing with his folks in those days was laying the groundwork for everything that was to come later in terms of real management and conservation. In 1994, Mike helped form the Southwest Working Group with the Declining Amphibians Task Force. He and his crew did statewide surveys of all of those species and important mark recapture projects on Yamapaensis and Chiricoensis, and notably identified other population declines of Yamapaensis in particular, and created standardized protocols. And one of the things that Mike had a ton of people working for him, so I gathered them all together for a photograph recently. Next, please. So this is Mike Shredel with his crew. He had more minions than anybody at Game and Fish, so everybody was jealous of Mike. But these minions did a heck of a lot of work all around the state on rabbit frog conservation. Next, please. So I mentioned that Mike Demlong had come from the Phoenix Zoo. One of the things that the Rabbit Frogs Project was doing under Mike's leadership, Mike Shredel's leadership, was trying to understand what was known then as Rana subaquafocalis, a species that was described in 1993 by Jim Platts. It was only known from Ramsey Canyon in the Huachuca Mountains, and there were already declines being noted. So animals were brought to the Phoenix Zoo. Mike Demlong was there at the time. They took an old fish production facility and turned it into the Lower Northern Conservation Center and started raising tadpoles and frogs for release back into the wild. And in 1995, they started translocations of Rana subaquafocalis back into Ramsey Canyon. Subaquafocalis was later subsumed into Chiricahua leopard frog, but that did not negate or minimize the conservation importance of what was done. Finally, in 1997, Mike produced, again, an internal document in June of that year on rabbit frog conservation and management. This included 3 important chapters, each co-authored by Jeff Allen, so he's still in the mix here. But it included the mark recapture studies that Mike had done on Arizona leopard frogs. It was a validation of what were called visual encounter surveys. That is a validation of the technique used to document how many animals were in an area and where they occurred. And then all of the work on status and distribution of Arizona's native leopard frogs and Terramara frog. So this was kind of the guiding document for the next steps in rabbit frog conservation. Next. And then the landscape changed for everyone. We knew about declining amphibians. We knew that the animals had died off, but we never knew why. We had lots of ideas, but none of them could seem to work. And then we discovered contridiomycosis, or affectionately known as BD for Trichophytrium dendrobatidus. That was first described in contridiomycosis was first described in '98, followed very quickly by a description of this chytrid fungus by Joyce Longhorn in 1999. So this was new information for us and for everybody else working on amphibians and amphibian fauna. And Game and Fish was all over it. Mike worked with partners down here in Tucson to understand some of the die-offs that had taken place. Fortunately, he had collected animals from 1992, I think it was, in Big Springs. Is that right, Mike? Some others of us had collected animals in 97 and 98, animals that had died, and we preserved those. Ray Bradley at the vet diagnostic lab here in Tucson did histology on these animals and demonstrated that contridiomycosis was in fact here in Arizona, and we later discovered that it went way back in time. I'm not going to dive into the history of BD in Arizona. That's for a whole other talk and another paper that Mike will write someday. Next. So here's a watershed moment for ratted frogs. The Arizona Sonora Desert Museum started raising Terramar frogs, tadpoles that were brought back from Mexico. Mike, I believe you were on those expeditions. They raised frogs just as the Phoenix Zoo was raising Suboc vocalis in the Phoenix Zoo. The Desert Museum was raising tea frogs. We went through the necessary hoops that we had to jump through at Game and Fish. I shouldn't say we, I wasn't part of that. Kim Field shepherded this, what is called a 12-step to what was required, a 12-step process before you could reintroduce an animal back into the wild. At least this is a requirement of Game and Fish. She produced this document with Roy and with Mike and with Terry Johnson, which gave us the authority, gave Game and Fish the authority to move these animals back into the wild. Then in 2004, Steve Hale and his son here, his son Gene, are releasing a couple of the first Terramar frogs back into the site where they had all disappeared while he was watching them die many years before. And then later on, Mike and Jim Borba did a paper on kind of the history of Terramar frog conservation, which is well worth the read. So, Chiricahua leopard frogs, one of the big priorities for Ratted Frogs Project. The surveys that were done around the state documented that Chiricahua leopard frogs were only left at a few sites compared to what they had been historically when they were described back in the 70s. They were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 2002. Mike worked with Jim Rohrbaugh, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Charlie Painter, the state herpetologist in Mexico, and a recovery team to organize a recovery team, and they produced the recovery plan for Chiricahua leopard frogs in 2006, I believe. Oh, I had that dated, but was it 2006? 7. So then that was the blueprint for Chiricahua leopard frog conservation and recovery that we still follow to this day. Next. One of the things that Kim Field was supposed to work on was safe harbor agreements, and she got this started. Mike, Jim Rohrbaugh with Fish and Wildlife Service, and Marty Teagle, also with Fish and Wildlife Service, cobbled together the statewide safe harbor agreement for Chiricahua leopard frogs. And this was a very important document, finished in 2006, because it was a mechanism for private landowners to participate in conservation of listed taxa without having to worry about suffering the possibility of take of those endangered species. So this is a very important document. We now have well over 60,000 acres covered under the safe harbor agreement. And I can't remember how many landowners, 20 some odd landowners or something. So this was a very important document that was produced. Next. going to swing back a little bit to Anka, the relic leopard frog. This is an animal that was thought to have gone extinct. Mike's crew did surveys in 2001 to 2003. Sean Blomquist was the lead on those. They surveyed all the possible habitats where relic leopard frogs could be or could have been, as well as could be. So this was a very important step in relic leopard frog conservation. Next. Then in 2005, the relic leopard frog conservation team, which had been created, I think, a couple of years before, produced the first conservation agreement and strategy for conservation of relic leopard frogs, with the important signatory agencies being the Game and Fish Department, BLM, Park Service, NDOW, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, this is a document that outlined management strategies in Nevada and Arizona. And Blomquist surveys helped to identify sunspots in Arizona where we might be able to reintroduce or introduce relic leopard frogs to help with their conservation. Next, please. That conservation agreement was renewed in 2016. We added Utah Division of Wildlife Resources as a signatory to the document because relic leopard frogs had also been known from the Virgin River and its tributaries in southwestern Utah. So this continues to be the guiding document for relic leopard frog recovery. Okay, next. I'm going to zip through the rest of this because what I was showing you is the history of game and fish, history of herpetology of game and fish. We are still doing all the things that Cecil identified back in the 1980s. We're still doing conservation work on tortoises. We're still doing it on mud turtles. We're still doing it on garter snakes. We're certainly still doing it on red frogs and flat-tailed horned lizards. So we got some new players. I came in 2005 as the Amphibians and Reptiles program manager into a very mature program. I hired Valerie Boyarsky as the next conservation planner, Christina Jones as the Turtles project coordinator, because Darren Riddle went off to graduate school. And then Christina hired Audrey Owens as her Turtles project biologist. Next. And new priorities popped up. Garter snakes were found to have been declining precipitously. I thought I had a slide in the middle here. What's the next one, Robert? Okay, go back. So work done by oh, that's it right there. Andy Holycross and others resurveyed the work or redid the work that Phil Rosen had done with Cecil Schwalbe and finished in 1988. And Andy and Bill Berger, Ernie Nigro, and Tom Brennan repeated that and extended it. And what we discovered from their work was that these two species of garter snake had declined since the Rosen and Schwalbe work from 1988. And then Valerie Boyarsky and Jeff Servos from Fish and Wildlife Service formed the Garter Snake Conservation Working Group to try and identify some management options that we could do for these garter snakes. And the first emphasis was on captive propagation, which we're still working on. I can say right now, last year we released 24 narrow-headed garter snakes that were raised at the Phoenix Zoo. We released them at Canyon Creek, a place where we already knew there were garter snakes, but we were also doing a study there. This year, grad student that's doing that work at Canyon Creek has already recaptured 3 of those, which is remarkable. 1 year later, for animals that had never seen the wild before they left the Phoenix Zoo. But it took almost a decade to figure out how to raise these animals in captivity. Narrow-headed garter snakes are very tough. Next. One of the big things that Christina Jones did while she was the Desert Tortoise or the Turtles Project coordinator was she coordinated the production or coordinated the production of the candidate conservation agreement for soaring desert tortoises. Again, I'm skipping over a whole lot of of background on listing and arguing and lawsuits and everything else that happened. But finally, in 2015, all of these agencies came together and signed the Canada Conservation Agreement, and agreed that they would do good things for desert tortoises. And it was this document that influenced the Fish and Wildlife Service to the point that they decided not to list the Sonoran desert tortoise as long as everybody kept doing what they're supposed to do. Was everybody still doing what they're supposed to do? Necessarily, but we're working. Next, just to go back to long-term monitoring plots, just to give you some perspective. They started out with one plot, this one in the far northeastern corner, this one right there. And then a couple of others. There was one about here or here. And now it's 17 long-term monitoring plots throughout the state that have been monitored many times over the last 3 decades. And we continue to monitor 3 to 4 plots each year through our wildlife contracts branch. Interestingly, the director of Game Fish Department came to me about 4 years ago, and he said, how many plots are we monitoring for Sonoran desert tortoises each year? And I said, well, we're lucky if we monitor 1. We just don't have the funds. And he said, well, we've got the funds now. So he basically gave us a big pile of money and said, do it. So we gave that to contracts branch. They have crews that go out every year. Right about now, you guys with Gary's crew will understand how much fun that is to go out in June and work on Sonoran desert tortoise plots. But now they're doing that every year. Okay, next. End of an era. And this is Mike again at his retirement party. He hadn't changed a bit over the years. He just has a ponytail now. That's the only thing that's different. So in 2016, Mike retired. Next, and Audrey Owens. We hired Audrey Owens as the new Random Frogs project coordinator. She is still the Random Frogs project coordinator. This is a history, not what's going on now. So we're skip next. And this is the history of Garter State project coordinator. Valerie Boyarsky left the program in 2012. Taylor Cotton took over in 2015, and then left us, dropped us like a hot rock, and went to Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife because he liked the mountains. And then Mason Ryan took over in 2017, and he is still our Garter State project coordinator. Next. And then Christina Jones left in 2021 for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Everybody goes to places where they get more money. And then Chad Ruki took over. Chad had a long history doing long-term monitoring plots with the contracts branch. Very well versed in tortoise and turtle biology. So he's working for us now. Next. And then our current crew for Random Frogs biologists are Ren Davison and Ian Littell. Next. So I'm going to go through these really quickly. So we're here to just click. But the Heritage Grant Program started in 1992. This was a program through which the department sent out money to external partners to do work. And that work would have been surveys, monitoring, trying some management ideas, all on priority species that the department had identified as species for which we need new information or more information. And I've shown you a couple of these, but I'm just going to flip through them. So go ahead, Robert, just flip through until you get to a red line. There's one by Phil Rosen. Then we added color, which is kind of cool. 94 Heritage Grant reports were done by the mid-2000s. These are 94 projects that the department funded for our partners throughout the state, and in some cases from other states, to do work. This has been, I would say it was probably a hassle for folks that came to fish because they had to review all of these. But the amount of information that has been gathered through these reports, many of which ended up being published by the authors of those reports, is amazing. We have this huge volume of information from which to draw conclusions or management options or look at new information, so forth and so on. Next. We also had produced non-game technical reports. Most of these were done under Terry Johnson's reign as the non-game branch chief, which ended in 2004. So he was there for quite a while, and his staff would write non-game technical reports, which are internal reports, again, forming a big body of information from which to draw for management. I've already shown you a few of these. Let's just go ahead and flip through. In the end, 37 non-game technical reports were done solely on amphibians and reptiles. And that's, again, an impressive body of work. And we still do non-game technical reports today. That one is a 2018 report on Chiricahua liver frog recovery activities that took place in 2016 or in 2017. Next. And I also want to point out that the history of game and fish and herpetology has been one of lots of publications in peer-reviewed literature. We're not just producing reports internally, but we produced a lot of papers in the peer-reviewed literature. And go ahead and flip through some of these. In the end, over 126 peer-reviewed publications. These include Herp review notes on behavior or natural history or distribution, but over 126. It's not an accurate count because I know that as I was working through this, I discovered other publications that had been done that I hadn't added to the total. But I think this is an impressive list. Most of this has nothing to do with me. This is my colleagues that preceded me at Game and Fish and did an awful lot of work, but we still are publishing in peer-reviewed literature. It's just a little bit more difficult because one, it's not our mandate, and two, we just don't have a whole lot of time. At dinner, we were talking about publishing papers and how much data we all have stacked up that needs to be done, and someday, yeah. Okay, next, I think. Oh yeah, one last thing. Part of the department's efforts have been in public outreach. Remember, Cecil started Herps with Twerps. Randy Babb worked with him. Randy continued with the department as an I&E Information Education Program Manager in Region 6 of the Mesa office. And he produced posters for the public, like this rattlesnake poster. Next one. He also produced a Gila monster poster. And then Christina Jones produced a desert tortoise poster several years ago as part of the outreach to the public. Next. And then I can't go on without further mentioning, although these are not written by Game and Fish authors, although Randy Babb worked for the Game and Fish Department, even while he was helping to write this. The first edition of Amphibians was in Arizona, and the second edition that came out last year. These are both books produced by the Game and Fish Department. So the department funded these and published them. Next. And that's it. And again, a reminder, none of this was done in a vacuum. There is a whole host of partners out there that made us look good in many cases and really helped with the conservation work that we've done. Thanks for your attention. Well, that took a long time, sorry, but
Well, thank you.
sure. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so had a state endangered species act passed in the Arizona legislature, like what would such a law have done that the federal endangered species act doesn't do?
Well, a lot of states have endangered species acts. California's got one, for instance. It depends on how you look at it. You know, a lot of people think that the state is closer to the ground and therefore they have more control and they're able to do the kinds of management actions that are necessary for recovery. Another way of looking at it is that it adds an extra layer of administrative work for anybody else who wants to work in those animals. So there are lots of different ways of looking at it, but the way the Game and Fish Department has always looked at it, and the commission in particular, is that they didn't want that extra bureaucracy stacked on top of the Fish and Wildlife Service that was already doing that.
So could the Game and Fish Department pass that law, or would they need the legislature to do that?
It would probably have to go to the legislature. The commission would never let that happen.
Okay.
Yes, Maggie.
Based on my current understanding, if there is a development project going in that is going to basically convert known desert tortoise habitat
I can
to,
anticipate the question.
No.
Go ahead.
you've heard it before, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm following up.
It's a legit question.
Is there any mechanism or way that a group or anybody could conceivably rescue those tortoises and relocate them to suitable habitat? My understanding is that there is not, so I'm asking.
There is not. One of the things that, just to go back to your question for a moment, a state endangered species law could probably help something like that because Sonoran desert tortoises are not listed federally. No, there isn't a way to do it. Concerns would be putting tortoises on top of other tortoises. You know, some of the difficulties they've run into in California. It's okay to move animals out of harm's way, but wholesale gathering of tortoises and moving them to another spot. We're not even sure what the ultimate effects would be, what their effects would have on the existing population. Would they survive? We don't know.
It's a question that's coming up in California.
Yeah.
As well.
Yes.
The question that's coming up in places like California that would have no status.
Right.
All of the problems exist, but it's being worked on.
Yeah, and they're doing the research, trying to understand how those translocations will work. Some of them have done okay, some of them not so good. So we haven't crossed that line. Since desert tortoises, Sonoran desert tortoises are still abundant and widespread, we've taken the approach to not try translocations, hence not doing them when there are developments, wholesale developments going in. But there are many instances in which, at least at the periphery of the development, they've affected desert tortoises, and we've encouraged our partners or our folks to move the tortoise out of the way. And whether that works or not, you know, these are animals that live a long time, they know their homes. So you build a house, and then they come back and
Yes.
fall into the basement that's been done.
They learn.
They learn.
Tortoises learn.
Yeah, they do,
Takes them a year or two, they learn.
they do. Yeah, good question. Anybody else?
There's a chat. Bob Beasy wonders if the game and fish protection of the Gila monster in the 50s was perhaps the earliest protection of a venomous reptile among state agencies.
That's a good question, Bob. I think it probably is. I don't know of any eastern states that protected any venomous snakes. I think that was probably unlikely. At least the Gila monster is not an aggressive animal that deliberately strikes to defend itself. So that was a little bit easier to protect them. But yeah, I've never heard of any others, Bob. Any of my folks online want to weigh in and correct me? Yeah, cut them off. Good. Anybody else? Yes.
Robert mentioned Amphibian research book on Sonoran desert turtles,
Yes.
and I'm curious whether the rapid kind of rise in popularity and code plants in the same that your agency has engaged with this whole long history of other conservation problems. Is this something that's a concern, and what's seen that by?
It's a concern, but it's not a big concern yet. One of the things that Sonoran desert toads have going for them is they're explosive breeders. And it's difficult to predict when and where we might find them. So it's not an easy thing to go in and just wholesalely remove lots and lots of animals in a season. There may be local population depletions that take place. Robert and I have talked about this quite a bit, and that might happen. We've seen some efforts to poach these animals beyond their bag and possession limits, but we haven't seen it in a widespread fashion. Just this past fall, I talked to our law enforcement folks. I asked a whole bunch of them what their experience has been with Sonoran desert toads and poaching, and they said it hasn't been on the radar at all. So that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means that the sale, the commerce hasn't risen to the point that law enforcement folks have noticed it. But certainly, it depends on the year. A few years ago, during the summer monsoon, when we had almost no monsoon, we didn't see any snoring desert toads popping up in places where we typically had. And then 2 years later, we get this amazing monsoon and the toads came out of the woodwork. So it's an extraordinarily difficult animal to monitor, to get at the kinds of questions that you're asking. A legitimate question, but a very difficult one to answer. Thank you. Sure.
Roy has a comment, I think. One small item related to the Endangered Species Act question is the addition of season closures for various species over the years and the prohibition of prying devices, habitat destruction to collect reptiles.
I couldn't cover everything.
Yeah.
But yes, that's a real good point. And he's saying that this is an example of game and fish management in the absence of the Endangered Species Act, the state Endangered Species Act. And those prohibitions on take have been very important. Protecting montane rattlesnakes many years ago, in 1968. These are animals that occur only on mountaintops in southeastern Arizona. Might be easy to knock back, might be easy to damage those populations. We don't want to find out if it is. And what he's referring to with the pry bars, Matt Good did a study with the Game and Fish Department on the effects of using pry bars and jacks to open up cracks in boulders, granite boulders, to get at snakes and chuckwallas, and demonstrated how much damage was caused by doing that. And collectors were using those techniques. So the Game and Fish Commission outlawed those techniques for getting at animals that dwell in boulders. So thanks, Roy.
Weren't there some chuckwalla relocation studies?
Yeah, so the contracts branch, and we work kind of with them, but a lot of things they have their own projects. When the Loop 202 was going in south of South Mountain in the Phoenix area, it was cutting through some habitat of chuckwallas, and the Gila River Indian community wanted those chuckwallas moved. So they marked a whole bunch of them and just moved them a fairly short distance, less than about a quarter mile, into the Phoenix or the South Mountain Park. I don't know how much monitoring has been done. A year later, they still had some success. Animals were still alive, but I don't remember the ultimate outcome of that. Carrie, you have a question?
Yes. So you went through a lot of really awesome programs, and I know there's a lot of attention on shared health across for this right now. But what do you see is the next emerging issue that you're going to deal with?
Climate change.
Yeah. That's why we're here and not in the boathouse.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and in terms of species or group of species.
Well, often states have to focus on species that dealing with something like climate change ends up being really difficult because you can't do it across all species in the country, right? So, yeah, I guess it would be focused on what species.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Climate change is probably going to affect a lot of endurance. So there are whole suites of explosive breeding endurance that rely on monsoon rains. And if we do see the shifts in the monsoon that we've seen for a couple of years where we didn't get much rain, that can cause real problems. Again, all of those species are hard to study, hard to monitor to really understand the status of them. So while I think those could be of conservation concern, I'm not sure how much we can do with them. A lot of folks have raised the specter of montane rattlesnakes and other montane species that all they have to do is go up. And what do we do with those? Do we do translocations farther north, where they might survive. And then we interfere with other communities. Tough questions, and I don't have a good answer for you. We are right now, we've been surveying Arizona toads for the last 3 years to prepare for a species status assessment by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's a species we focused on, but the only reason we're focusing on it is because it's been proposed for listing, and there's a species status assessment coming up, and nobody knows anything about the Arizona toads, so we're trying to find out. So oftentimes our conservation priorities are dealt to us by circumstances that arise outside of our control.
I thought I'd add that one of Darren Riedel's publications on adult mortality on Arizona desert tortoises, that other than human caused, was mountain lion predation and getting stuck between rocks.
Yeah.
The capital of the Auburn Nation is Cells, but its original name is Komsko de Dwalsk, which means tortoise stuck.
Oh, really?
So
how cool.
when they got to that, when they established that as a town, the original name was that because they saw a tortoise that had been stuck and wedged somewhere
Wow.
in the wash there. So I thought it was an interesting.
That is very interesting. Thanks. Yeah, I have seen tortoises stuck wedged in the cracks. What a horrible way to go.
Yeah, or they fall too.
Yeah. Anything else?
Thank
Okay,
you all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tom.